Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the Simon Armitage poem Remains. Now let's start off by looking at the poet himself, Simon Armitage, an exam board favourite. I've been a teacher for 12 years and in all of that time Simon Armitage's poetry has been on the literature exam in one form or another. So he was born in 1963 in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire, and actually recently elected an Oxford Professor of Poetry. And if you go onto the Oxford University podcast website, there are 3 very interesting lectures that Armitage gave about poetry, which you can download for free. So do check those out if you love poetry. Now, this poem is quite an interesting one because although Armitage wrote it, it's not about his own experience. The poem is taken from the collection The Not Dead from 2008. This was originally aired as a Channel 4 documentary film, which you can watch on YouTube. It's a collection of poems about discharged servicemen. So basically there are poems written about the stories from people who were serving in the armed forces but have since left the armed forces. And Remains is based on the true story of this man, Guardsman Tromans, who was a machine gunner in the Iraq War in 2003. If you want to, you can watch the poetry analysis of Manhunt, also on my channel, which is another poem from this collection. But to understand the story of this poem, let's read it, because it's quite easy to understand, and then I'll add some extra details. On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all 3 of us open fire, 3 of a kind, all let in fly. And I swear, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Okay, so an absolutely true story. Basically, the situation was explained further in the documentary. The soldiers were called to clear a bank which was being robbed. People were looting it, and as they approached the bank, one man ran out, so they shot him. But they had to clear the whole building, which was 4 or 5 stories high. And when the building was cleared, the soldier Tromans was on the roof, and he looked down outside onto the ground and saw that the man was still there screaming on the road. And eventually he was taken off, never to be seen again. And this was the first time that the soldier had killed anybody, and he couldn't forget it. And he suffered from great distress and stress from the situation, eventually leaving the army. And that stress led to a period of crime and substance abuse. So in terms of the power and conflict cluster then, Remains is about the after effects of conflict. It compares well with War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy in that it explores how the blending together of conflict zones and domestic life causes problems. Ultimately, it's about the true horror of war, the undescribable horror of war, and in that way it is also very similar to Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes and Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Now, what I want to do is analyse some of the structure and the language used in this poem. And as always, we're not just looking for things that we find in the poem, but we're trying to link them to the meaning. So let me give you some examples. Let's start by looking at structure. This poem begins mid-action. On another occasion, we get sent out. Now, on reading this, the reader is immediately on the back foot. We're not fully aware of the situation taking place. If this is another occasion, what were the previous ones? And this structural choice is a deliberate choice to start the poem mid-action with the suggestion clearly that something's gone before. And it helps us to understand the lack of ease that the soldiers would have felt joining a war zone. Nothing is neatly controlled and organised. Everything is chaos. And that is reflected in this sort of chaotic, unstable opening where we don't know the whole story, just like the soldiers wouldn't know the whole story. They would have been told to go to this bank. They wouldn't have known everything that was going on. So we're put in that position through the structural choice to begin the poem mid-action. There's some repetition in this poem as well. So in the early part of the poem, the soldier is feeling guilty, and he wants to make it very clear that he was not the only one who shot the looter. He was not the only one to blame. So he describes the shooting, and he says, "Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly." Now, what's interesting here is that we have the repetition of somebody else twice, which is used to deflect the blame from the soldier alone. He wants to make it clear that others were involved, and he repeats the phrase somebody else to minimise his own role. He could have just said, myself and two others, but syntactically, sentence structure-wise, this line now becomes dominated by the other soldiers. It suggests the narrator was not the main culprit. There's a sense that he doesn't want to accept the lone or solitary blame for what has taken place. And this repetition to shift blame is seen again in the same stanza, where the narrator explains, all three of us open fire, three of a kind. So we've got the repetition of three, and it performs the same function as the repetition of somebody else. It allows the narrator to feel that he's not solely or wholly to blame. But that shift actually changes later in the poem, and by the end we see that it is very much just about the narrator. He explains his bloody life in my bloody hands, and the use of the word my here marks a shift. The poem ends with the acknowledgement that the narrator is taking responsibility. It might have been a joint decision, but the reality is that at home again, on leave now, not in the war zone, he deals with the consequences alone. The effect on him is the effect on him. He's not with his other soldiers. Now, just to say that the analysis of the pronoun my would actually be language analysis, but we're looking specifically at where it appears in the poem, which makes it a structure point. A lot of you message me saying you struggle with structure points, and one of the ways to do it is to think, well, choose something you're going to analyse and see if you can analyse where it appears and why that is important. Another structural device is enjambment. This is, of course, where sentences flow over onto separate lines. And Armitage uses enjambment to show the life-changing moment when the soldier shot the looter. Three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. So there's enjambment here, not just carrying a sentence over onto another line, but actually there's a whole stanza break here. And this break between the action causes the reader to stop. And it emphasises how this precise moment as the soldier shot the looter is the big moment of his life. It has ruined his life. From this point on, the soldier became a different person. So the forced break of line and stanza reflects the broken man the soldier became after this event took place. Armitage uses sentence length to reflect the trauma the soldier experienced. We get this sense that he's in this war zone, and in the documentary he talks about how it was non-stop, 24/7 adrenaline, fear and danger, and he's in this war zone at risk of dying, but then he goes home on leave, and you get the sense that okay, you've got a break from the army now and you go home on leave and it's going to be okay. And of course he finds that it's not. He finds that he has these nightmares. He can't forget the man. He turns to drink and to drugs, and ultimately cannot get over the trauma that was caused in war, which is something that we find throughout the world, isn't it? This post-traumatic stress, whatever you want to call it, this idea that the effects of war don't just switch off when you go home. So there is a sense, though, that he thought they would switch off when he went home. Look at this line here, "Then I'm home on leave." Now, we've had a lot of Jean Mont in the poem, but here we just have a very short sentence with a full stop. The full stop, caesura, causing a pause or a stop in the middle of a sentence, the middle of a line. This suggests that there's a sense of finality to this short, blunt sentence. The narrator feels that going home will change things, will switch things off. But of course that's not what happens. And to emphasize this, the next stanza has some repetition again. We see he's probably armed, possibly not, is exactly the same as line 4, probably armed, possibly not. Just to say, guys, this "and" shouldn't be there. I apologize for that. You just need to be careful that if you're looking at online notes about poems and online editions of poems, they are exactly the same as the one in your anthology, because occasionally there are different drafts of poems, and some are in the anthology one way and not another, and that kind of thing. So you can forget the word "and" here for your edition of this poem, but you can see, look, the line, the phrase "probably armed, possibly not" is repeated. And of course that again then is a structural point. Repetition is a structural point here. Now why? Well, it gives the poem a cyclical structure. Near the end of the poem, we're reminded and taken right back to the near start of the poem. The whole thing goes round in a circle, which suggests that the trauma the soldier has experienced is inescapable. Cyclical structure is seen in a lot of poems, as you'll notice as you've been watching my videos. Do make sure you're watching all the videos in this playlist, because I'm covering all of them. So those are some points on structure. Now let's have a look at language. The first thing I think is really interesting about language in this poem is to do with the title, Remains. What does it mean? What does it make you think of? Why not pause the video and discuss or think about that? What does remains make you think of? Well, the dictionary defines it as the parts left over when other parts have been used, removed or destroyed. And what a perfect definition for this poem. The soldier has been used in the machine of war, and all that is left is no good to anybody. He is a broken person mentally now. And there are lots of ways that we can analyse the importance of this title. Another connotation of the word remains links to the description of a person's body after death. We say we're going to, collect the remains, we're going to bury the remains. It's to do with when somebody has died. And knowing that this is a war poem from a collection of war poems, we might expect that to be the meaning. But of course the soldier in the poem doesn't die, at least not physically, but metaphorically part of him does die. Something inside of him on a deep level dies when he shoots the looter. And on a literal level there are the remains of the bank looter. The blood shadow is a literal physical remain that stays on the street. And the remains here could be the constant reminder of the looter. What remains is the memory of the looter here in my head. So there's the remaining memory, the physical mark on the street, the blood, but the memory in his head as well. Lots of ways you can analyse the importance of the title. Now, one of the most instantly recognisable things is the everyday language in this poem and the colloquialisms. There's a lot of informal, sort of conversational language. We see, for example, how the looter legs it up the road, and that's a good example. Now, the language choice is, at least to begin with, a very relaxed and casual, and we need to ask ourselves, why is that? Well, there's a couple of ideas, I think. On the one hand, it points out how this event was an everyday event for the soldiers. That comes across very clearly in the documentary. Every day being put into life-threatening situations. And because this is the kind of thing that they constantly did, it's just another occasion, as the opening line puts it. It's just another one of many things. It's conversational. It's not described in this kind of as if it's a special or a unique event, because it literally wasn't. But the casual language does not remain throughout. As the soldier shoots the looter, the poem is filled with horrific imagery, such as every round rips through his life, a violent metaphor, but all the more so violent and shocking when we contrast it to the previous use of casual language. So that's a structure point. Armitage has juxtaposed two different types of language, put them next to each other to show the difference between the two, because it paints a stronger picture of the before and after effects of conflict on the soldier, from carefree and relaxed to severely traumatized. Armitage's use of vague language as well reflects the indescribable horror of war, just like Ted Hughes's bayonet charge. He's on the ground, sort of inside out, is an interesting phrase for a poet to use. Sort of is very vague language, and I think it reflects the impossibility of describing what is actually happening. This man's been shot and his innards have come out, and you can't describe it. He doesn't have the words for it. He doesn't have the vocabulary for it. We saw that, didn't we, in Ted Hughes's bayonet charge. Ted Hughes didn't have the vocabulary, didn't have the words to explain what was happening, so he had to go to Wilfred Owen's poetry to be able to express what was going on, which is why there are so many similarities between Ted Hughes's bayonet charge and one of the early poems of Wilfred Owen. So it suggests that despite his army training, the narrator in this poem is not prepared for the harsh reality of killing somebody. And then the treatment of the wounded man is described with the imagery of bin men. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, then is carted off in the back of a lorry. The use of the verb tosses shows a complete disrespect for the man, as if he is literally a piece of rubbish. The fact that he's tossed into a lorry cannot help but make the reader picture bin men doing their weekly round, tossing bin bags into the back of the van. And these language choices reflect the treatment of the looter as rubbish, show the disrespect for human life on this occasion. So back at home on leave, the soldier, the narrator, he turns to substance abuse, but the drink and drugs won't flush him out. Now the him in question is clearly the looter. The memory of the looter will not disappear from the soldier's mind, but it's the verb flush that I'm interested in here. When do we flush something out? We link it to sickness, don't we? If you have a fever, you've got to flush it out to expel the sickness from the body. And flush in this sense means to cleanse, to rid of something unpleasant. It's the same with the toilet. We use large quantities of water to cleanse it, to flush it out. So the word flush suggests that the soldier is now unclean and sick because of the shooting. And when describing the memory of the looter being stuck in the soldier's head, Armitage uses the war metaphor, dug in behind enemy lines. Such an interesting line, because it might at first seem quite fitting in a war poem, but we have to remember that the narrator is at home on leave. So the use of war imagery whilst at home on leave reflects the impact war has had on him. At the beginning he was at war using casual language you might expect him to use at home. Now he's at home using the language you would expect him to use in the war. And it reflects the impact war has had on him. He begins to think in a manner associated with war and conflict. It's inescapable. He cannot stop. He cannot switch off. Now he's at home. He cannot switch off the soldier side of him. The phrase sun-stunned, sand-smothered land is also worthy of analysis. As I read it there, you would see the sibilance, the repetition of the soft S sound 4 times. And Armitage wants to emphasise the significance of this line, so the sibilance causes us to stop and look closely at it. Now we've got compound adjectives here, sun-stunned, sand-smothered. And there's a positive image in both of these, sun and sand, but then it turns sinister through the adjoining words stunned and smothered, aggressive, violent words. And this reflects how there's nothing positive left for the narrator. Everything he experiences is now tainted with the evil of war. Very clever language choice from Armitage. Finally then, the poem in the link at the end, My Bloody Hands, is a link to Shakespeare's Macbeth. In Act 2, Scene 2 of the play, Lady Macbeth urges her husband to wash the blood from his hands. He's just killed the king. And she tells him a little water clears us of this deed, links to the flushing again. But this is an extended metaphor in Macbeth, where the image of blood and water is used to show that murderous deeds are impossible to wash away. And Lady Macbeth actually returns to this image when she's insane. So bloody hands is a reference to Macbeth here. Just like Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, murder and horrific images of the murdered cannot be forgotten. They stay with the soldier, causing this mental damage. I hope you found this video useful, guys. Check out mrbruff.com, the ebooks there. There is a poetry ebook which contains detailed notes on, I think, about 10 of the poems. Not this one, because this one is in copyright and I couldn't get copyright permission for it, but it will help you with the other poems. And if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to the channel.